After watching Alexandra Bell's Rewriting Racist Headlines, we realized how prevalent headlines marginalizing minorities are in the New York Times publications. However, what we still wanted to know was whether this was a problem within the institution or society as a whole. We chose to explore the portrayal of minorities through the lens of Michael Brown's murder. After analyzing multiple articles focused on the aftermath of his death, it is apparent to us that news outlets across the board use language that convey an obvious bias against Black people. Through language, the various authors negatively portray Michael Brown and minimize the severity of his murder.
U.S. Representative Ron DeSantis calls a group of African Americans monkeys. Anthony Federico, an ESPN writer, called Asian basketball player Jeremy Lin a chink in the armor. The New York Times portrays Michael Brown and Darren Wilson in the same light, saying, "Two lives at a crossroads in Ferguson. Two American white swimmers accused of robbery were shown through a picture of Usain Bolt, a Black Olympic sprinter." The Herald Sun mocks Serena Williams' behavior at the Wimbledon final, showing her exaggerated facial expressions, which are reminiscent of Jim Crow-era cartoons.
18-year-old African-American Michael Brown was shot by 28-year-old white police officer Darren Wilson. The event took place on August 9, 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri. The event sparked intense outrage about police brutality towards Black people in the United States, and the Brown family decided to sue Ferguson for the unjust murder of their son. The first article we looked at was published by The Hill and written by John Lott, Jr. The author talks about the event 3 years after it took place. Through story selection, spin, and emotive language, the author demonstrates explicit bias towards Michael Brown and his family, and clearly supports Darren Wilson, the man who murdered Michael Brown. In the beginning of the article, the author describes what occurs when Michael Brown and Darren Wilson had their first interaction, according to him. He states that first, Michael Brown robbed a store, then that he assaulted a policeman fighting for the officer's gun, and that the officer was left badly bruised and worried that he might lose consciousness. Here we can see an example of bias through story selection, because the author chooses to only mention the events that occurred before Michael Brown was brutally shot. The effect of the author only showing a small glimpse of the event causes Darren Wilson to be depicted as a victim and Michael Brown as the aggressor, when in reality it was the other way around. Later in the article, we can also see that the author uses bias through spin by purposefully quoting Brown's stepfather, saying bad words and making him look uncivil. The author says that Brown's stepfather incited demonstrators to burn this motherfucker down and burn this bitch down. At least 14 people were injured and 12 buildings set on fire in the ensuing violence. Instead of the author drawing attention to Michael Brown's death, he not only focuses on negatively portraying his stepfather, but blames his stepfather for the protests that took place in the aftermath of his stepson's death. At the end of the article, the author uses bias through emotive language to highlight how he believes that Wilson should have received settlement instead of Brown and his family. The author describes Wilson as a well-regarded officer who had just received a commendation for bravery and for apparently saving the life of a 2-year-old Black child. The author includes the story of Wilson saving the Black child and attempts to represent him as a hero and make the reader diminish the fact that he killed a Black teen and instead applaud him for saving a life. The author only mentions that the child who was saved was Black to eliminate the probability that Wilson's actions were done due to racism.
Now let's take a look at the Wall Street Journal's presentation of this issue. The description of the monetary compensation Michael's family received communicates an obvious favorable bias towards the white perpetrator. Author Chris Maher uses diction, omission, placement, and tactful details to distance Mr. Wilson from Michael Brown's murder. Let's start with diction. The title of the piece, Ferguson Reaches Settlement with Family of Michael Brown, gives the reader the impression that transgressions have been reconciled. Without even mentioning the perpetrator, the author has already encouraged the reader to believe that his debts are annulled. Mentioning that Michael Brown's family has settled implies that their loss has been sufficiently subsidized, and this implication that Darren Wilson has been forgiven, at least in some regard, makes him relatively less hateable. Essentially, Maher minimizes his guilt. Secondly, the author uses a euphemism that minimizes the violence of the white police officer. Michael's demise is described as a wrongful death rather than the murder or killing that it was. This dilutes the severity of Darren Wilson's crimes and forces the reader to reconsider how they view him. Thirdly, throughout the article, the author refers to Michael as Mr. Brown. This choice is effective in distancing from his age of merely 18. The reader sees Mr. Brown as a mature, experienced adult, rather than the child that he was in reality. Understanding that the death of a child is far more outrageous than that of an adult, the reader begins to mitigate Wilson's actions. Maybe it was not as bad as they thought. Now let's look at omission and placement. Omission is the second tool used to achieve the discussed bias. The author touches upon the racism wrapped up in the Michael Brown murder, but only briefly and at the end of the article. This is where placement comes into play. The placement of this discussion insinuates a lack of importance. Black people being marginalized is exhibited by the failure to attend to the issue of racism they face in this situation. Now let's discuss detail selection. Maher includes specific pieces of information that are successful in distancing Darren Wilson from Michael Brown's death. At one point he says, "The U.S. Justice Department also decided not to bring civil rights charges against Mr. Wilson, finding that credible witnesses supported his account that Mr. Brown attacked him." Maher indicates Wilson's innocence by explaining that the Justice Department did not choose to bring any charges against him. Ultimately, the article by The Hill and the Wall Street Journal convey a bias cohesive to the ones featured in Alexandra Bell's video. Michael Brown, a black man, is characterized as a villain, whereas Darren Wilson, a white police officer, is seemingly distanced from the cruelty of his actions.
This next recording is John Smith interviewing Leslie McSpaden, Michael Brown's mother.
I am John Smith, and I am here with Leslie McSpaden, the mother of Michael Brown Jr., who was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. I have a couple questions for you, Leslie, if you don't mind me asking them. My first question is, after reading the Hill article about you and your family's settlement that you reached, how do you feel about the ways in which Darren Wilson, the perpetrator, was killed? Portrayed.
I feel like the way that Darren Wilson was portrayed in the Hill's article is misleading and unacceptable, since they portray Wilson as a hero who is the real victim of this tragedy. Their ridiculous claim that the person who should have received a settlement is Wilson. He was a well-regarded officer who had just received commendation for bravery for apparently saving the life of a 2-year-old black kid. I am so pissed off by the fact that the Hill can even consider that Wilson is the good guy, and that he should have received the settlement. My son, Michael Brown Jr., was the victim of this atrocity, and Wilson's action cannot be condemned. This event has been so hard on me and my family, and the ways that outlets like The Hill have made this process much more painful. We appreciate all the support we're receiving, but in instances like this, we're very disappointed.
I can see how that could be disappointing. So my second question is, how will you use this example of a race-driven hate crime to affect the ways that you will move forward?
Yeah, so after the tragic death of my son, it took me a while to be able to cope with the fact that he wasn't around anymore. His death made me realize how our society is still filled with cruelty and racism. I thought about how I could prevent these things from happening to others in the future. I decided I would personally try to encourage changes. I'll be running for Ferguson City Council, like I quoted when I announced my candidacy at the exact spot my son was killed. I said, "I learned to walk again, and this is one of my first steps. Hopefully I will get influence if I become part of the City Council, and you can be sure I will try to make some significant changes to avoid such tragedy from taking place all over again."
Thank you very much, Ms. Spaden.
I'm here with Michael Brown Sr. today to interview him. I'm very happy to have you, and I have a few questions for you.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, how has this tragedy affected you as the father of a black man who was killed in a hate crime?
So, as many might obviously
understand, this tragedy has personally affected me in many obvious ways. The death of my son is hard to myself and to my family, and it's another example of a hate crime against an African American. This crime was fueled by a racial bias against my son and should not ever be permitted. The fact that the courts could not indict Wilson baffles me and frustrates me to no end. Articles such as The Hill portray my son as the problem and Wilson as the victim. How in God's name does that make any logical sense? If my son was killed by a white police officer, how is he the victim? That doesn't make any sense to me. Certain media outlets really like to portray my son as a criminal who rapped, smoked, and did drugs, and they say, oh, this is what any 18-year-old would do, and portray him as a criminal. But the fact that my son is dead and he is being portrayed as the perpetrator is really offensive to me and cannot be permitted.
Thank you. I can tell you're very upset with the way The Hill portrayed the tragedy of the death of your son. Do you feel like The Hill is biased by omission and leave out significant parts about racism?
Of course I'm upset, yes, I agree. I think that The Hill, like many other articles, many other articles and outlets have been biased against my son because of his race. So the fact that he's dead is by a racist hate crime has made me very angry myself. But when I read specifically the Hill's article, I was mad at the ways when they portrayed Michael's killer and Michael himself. They said that Wilson was left badly bruised and worried that he would lose consciousness. They totally leave out the fact that Wilson was racially attacking my son and racially profiling him and targeting him because he was a black man, and that he was killed, and he was unarmed, and he was killed in cold blood. And I definitely believe that this article was biased against my son, and there was no way trying to show that the way that his death could have been easily prevented, or how it was a racist, violent action. And I think that the bias in this situation was bias by omission, because I feel as though they are leaving out important facts that will help people understand the other side, not the side that they want people to understand.
Evidently, the presentation of the Michael Brown tragedy was worthy of the outrage it received. The black teen is marginalized by these news institutions, which matters because it contributes to the racial prejudices plaguing society today.